Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the South Before the Civil War. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. First off, we're going to talk about some of the advantages that the South had over the North. We're going to start out with the fact that they were fighting a defensive war. They were fighting the war on their territory. So this allowed them a lot of advanced knowledge, advanced warning, and ability to prepare. They also had a much better size of their army, at least initially. They had better trained forces with military leadership, so those two go together. And they had agriculture, so they could make all the food they need, or a lot of the food that they needed, and they had an economic system based on agriculture. So those were some of the advantages of the South. And now we're going to shift into the economy. All right, folks, now let's move into the economy. We're going to spend a couple minutes on this because this is one area where the North had a huge advantage, and I want you to actually see why. You see that we've got a number of charts and graphs and maps here, and this is going to help us understand just how precarious, how rough the Southern economy actually was and would prove to be during the war. So let's start out with the year 1860, a comparison. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see what's happening. So as you can see, the North had double the population of the South. All right. Now, the South had a lot more farm acreage because they were primarily agrarian. They were based on farming. But the value of their farmland was not quite as much as what the North had. The railroads, they did not have as many railroads as the North. Manufacturing, it's almost negligible. It's almost not worth mentioning because they really didn't have very many factories. And because they didn't have factories, they didn't have industrial workers. And now this is what's interesting, this capital stock of banks. That's where you're talking about money, actual cash on hand that banks could use to make loans and to just further economic development. As you can see, the South has almost nothing and the North has quite a bit. That's going to be very, very important down the line. All right, so I want you to keep that in mind. The idea that the banking system of the South was not really established very well. Let's take a look at this bar graph down here, and it will give you a sense of what the South was looking at. So, all right, you see here the total population. This was the Union, the blue is the Union, and then the South is here. So now you see a breakdown in percentages. So this gives you a better, more specific idea of just how much more the North had than the South in certain things. Now, when we get down to free men in military service, that's important. That's why the South initially has an advantage, and as you will soon see, the first few battles of the Civil War, the North does not win, the South wins. And this is primarily why. The fact that there were so many free men in military service, 75% to the South, to the North's 25%. So that's going to be a big difference. The idea, the fact that Europe needed cotton, initially that was beneficial to the South as well, the fact that they were producing 96% of the nation's cotton. So initially, those two things were advantages. So I want you to keep that in mind. Now let's move into the population, the slave population of the South here. And this is, you can see this map, and over here down at the bottom left, it shows the density, the concentration of slaves. And as you can see, in the North, there's almost nothing, and in the South, you've got a heavy, heavy concentration of slaves. At this point, you actually have more slaves than white people in the South. So just to give you a sense of their population demographics. Now, speaking of their economy, I want to draw your attention to this next graphic right here that breaks down how what the South's money looked like. So let's look at this. So the North was only printing money just a little bit. All right, they were only 13%. It wasn't really that big of a deal. Most of their funding for the war came from bonds. And a bond is something that a government or a state or a nation puts out and says, hey, listen, we need some money. If you invest and give us money now, we'll pay you more later. It's kind of like a loan, but it's a loan for government. So most of the Northern War effort was funded by bonds, which made them much, much more successful. They also had some taxes, and there were some people who just provided contributions. Now, the South, on the other hand, printed money willy-nilly. They didn't have as many bonds, and they didn't have as many taxes or contributions. Now, why is it a problem to print money? You think, well, just make more money and everything's great. Well, think about a cap of bleach, right? If you just take a cap of bleach and you drink it, what's going to happen to you, right? It's going to be bad. It's not going to be good. It's going to be a bad day for you. Now, what happens if you take that same cap of bleach, dump it in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, stir it around a little bit, and then accidentally swallow a mouthful of the pool water? Is anything bad going to happen to you? Well, You might feel a little nauseous, maybe not feel so hot because of the idea that you swallow pool water and Lord only knows like who peed in it or something, but it's not going to kill you. You're going to be all right because that bleach has been diluted. And when you print money, you cause something called inflation, and that's the dilution of money. So what the South really did was bankrupt itself by printing all this money, and that is going to be a big, big deal moving forward during the war effort. Okay, folks, let's talk about society and culture. I'm going to have a couple of slides about this, but I wanted to start out with the general big picture and then get into specifics. So this slide is all about the big picture. So we need to have a discussion about nationalism versus sectionalism. Now, the North was very nationalist. They were more driven to maintain the Union, whereas the South was very sectionalist. They placed their region ahead of the interests of the nation, all right? And this was the big battle that led to the key outbreak of the Civil War. The idea that the South felt threatened because their economic system and their way of life was threatened. And so they became increasingly sectionalist. Now, below you see this chart down here. We saw it on the previous slide with the demographics of the South, where you have a high concentration of slaves. I also want to draw your attention to this chart here that I found online. Some important ideas you need to keep in mind. Now, this breaks down over here on the top the slaves as a percentage of the population. So you see the border states. The border states did not secede. They remained loyal to the Union even though they were slave states. You have the Middle South, then you have the Lower South. All right, this is where most of the cotton was produced. And then in the Middle South, you have a mix of tobacco and cotton, and you have the major crop for the border states where it was tobacco and grains. The fact that those states did not secede, that's going to hurt the South during the Civil War. So the big picture here is cotton. Cotton, 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 known as King Cotton. This idea is going to become very, very important during the Civil War because the South is going to attempt to engage in this item called King Cotton diplomacy. They're going to bank on the fact that England needs their cotton and that then England will step in and help them. And that's their battle plan. That's their fallback plan for the war. That's going to be very important, so keep that in mind. So this is just some basic big picture ideas about society and culture in the South. It was all about sectionalism. It was all about slavery. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, on this slide, I'm going to talk about the social classes and population of both the North and the South. On the left-hand side, this is the breakdown of the Southern classes. Okay, so you have wealthy plantation owners at the top, and they represent very few of the population. You have the yeoman farmers, which are kind of like poor whites with very little land, not very many slaves. And then you have the slaves, which are the lowest part of the social pecking order, but they also comprise the majority of the population. So they're the lowest class, but they're also the class with the biggest numbers. Okay, and if you look on the right-hand side, you're looking at the North. You have the wealthy, of the working class, servants and urban poor, and free blacks. So you have a greater distribution of population here, okay? Now, above these triangles, you see these other triangles with no labels. This represents the concentration of wealth. So, if you look at the population concentration, there's very few wealthy plantation owners, but they have almost all the wealth. That's a massive, massive economic imbalance, and it's going to be a problem for the South down the line. The North had much more evenly distributed classes. The wealth still had more money, but because they had additional social classes and there was more wealth going around in those classes, they had a bit more of a stable foundation, all right? Whereas the South, all of the wealth, almost all of it, was concentrated in this very, very tiny percentage of people. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. So what did we learn? Well, we learned about the fact that the South was fighting a defensive war. They were fighting on their own territory, and that's very important. We learned that they had a decent size of their army, at least at the beginning of the war, and that helped them win early battles. Also, this military leadership. Most of the West Point graduates, remember that was the officer school that Thomas Jefferson established when he was president. Most of the West Point graduates were Southerners. So the South had a lot of military leadership. They also had a lot of agriculture. Now, when we're talking about economically and socially, we learned about how they had some issues economically because they didn't have diverse resources. They didn't have diverse social classes, and almost all of the wealth was concentrated in a very small percentage of the population. All right, so I hope this broke down the South for you, and I will see you next time.